Hello friends, welcome back to Medico Srinjoy. Today we'll study the very important bone in the face, which is the maxilla. If you like these videos, please subscribe the channel and hit the like button and share these videos with your friends and share knowledge. So without wasting time, let's start the video. So today we'll study the maxilla. The maxilla is a cheekbone, or it is the second largest bone of the face, and the first being the mandible. We have already covered the mandible, so if you don't see this, then you can visit the channel's playlist and you may watch the mandible. So let's start the side determination of the maxilla. The anterior surface of the maxilla ends in a nasal notch, and so we can see that the anterior surface there is a nasal notch, and the alveolar border of socket of the upper teeth, which is convexity directed downward, and the medial surface we have the maxillary hiatus or the antrum of Higmore. So clearly we can see that the side determination can be easily done by the nasal notch, which will be in the medial direction. Next we will go on to the features of the maxilla. Clearly there are one body and four processes of the maxilla. I repeat, there is one body of maxilla and four processes in the maxilla. The processes are like the frontal process, the zygomatic process, the alveolar process, and the palatine process. We'll study each of these five in detail. So let's start with the body. The body of the maxilla is pyramidal in shape, and it has four surfaces, which encloses the large cavity we already studied in the dental anatomy and oral histology lectures, that is the maxillary sinus. So the maxillary bone contains a maxillary sinus and it is the body part. So the four surfaces are the anterior or the facial surface, the posterior or the infratemporal surface, the superior or the orbital surface, and the medial or the nasal surface. We'll study each of these four surfaces features, like the let's start with the facial surface or the anterior surface. The anterior surface is directed downward and laterally, and it contains the incisive fossa, the canine fossa, and the canine eminence. You can appreciate that from medial to lateral on the anterior surface, from above the alveolar process present the incisive fossa, canine eminence, and the canine fossa. You may see in the bone that it start with the incisive fossa. Next we have the canine eminence, and third we have the canine fossa. Next we have above the canine fossa there is the infraorbital foramen, which transmit the infraorbital nerves and the vessels. Next we move on to the posterior or the infratemporal surface. The posterior surface we can appreciate is a convex and direct backward and laterally. You may see in the bone that it forms the anterior wall of the infratemporal fossa, and it is separated by the zygomatic process by a rounded ridge. You can appreciate here that there is a rounded ridge and it processes the first molar teeth. Next we can see in the bone that near the center of the surface there opens two or three alveolar canals for the posterior superior alveolar nerve and its vessels. So this concludes the posterior surface. Next we move on to the orbital or the superior surface. We have to understand in the orbital surface that the surface present the infraorbital groove. You can appreciate here the infraorbital groove leading towards and the infraorbital canal here, which opens on the anterior surface as the infraorbital foramen. Next we move on to the last surface, which is the medial or the nasal surface. The medial surface forms a part of the lateral wall of the nose. So here we get that the medial surface forms the lateral wall of the nose, and posterior superiorly you can see here that it displays a large irregular opening, which is the maxillary hiatus, which opens into the maxillary sinus. So it concludes the body of the maxilla. So let's revise that the body of the maxilla contains the maxillary sinus. Here we have the four surfaces, the anterior and the facial surface, the posterior or the infratemporal surface, superior or the orbital surface, and finally the medial or the nasal surface. Next let's move on to the processes of maxilla. There are four processes. We already know that the zygomatic process, frontal process, alveolar process, and the palatine process. Let's start with the zygomatic process. Here you can appreciate the zygomatic process in the bone. So here superolaterally we have a rough inclination with the zygomatic bone, so it is clearly called as a zygomatic process. Next we move on to the frontal process. Here we can see the frontal process. The frontal process project upward and backward to articulate above the nasal margin of the frontal bone. So clearly we get to know here it joins the frontal bone. On the lateral surface, it is divided by a vertical ridge. You can appreciate here there is a vertical ridge here and the anterior lacrimal crest into a smooth anterior part and a grooved posterior part. Also, there is a medial surface. We can see the ethmoidal crest in the horizontal ridge. Here you can see that the ethmoidal crest is present here. It is like a horizontal crest, and we can also see the middle nasal concha. Okay. Next, we have also can see the antrum of the middle meatus in the area of the ethmoidal crest. It's a hollow out portion. You can appreciate in the bone here that there is a presence of the ethmoidal crest and the antrum of middle meatus. So this concludes the frontal process. Next, we move on to the alveolar process. The alveolar process forms the alveolar arch. Okay, you can here see that the alveolar arch which bears the socket of the tooth of the upper 8 teeth. It can be easily noticed that there are 8 teeth in the maxilla on the one half, so it encloses the upper 8 teeth. Also, there is a buccinator arises from the posterior part of its outer surface on the first molar. Also here the buccinator muscle attaches. Next we move on to the last process, which is the palatine process. Here you can appreciate the palatine process is a thick horizontal plate which project medially. You can appreciate in the bone here that it is a horizontal plate. It also, you can see here that it also forms a large part of the roof of the mouth and the floor of the nasal cavity. Clearly it is visible that it forms the roof of the mouth and the floor of the nasal cavity. So it concludes our palatine process. Now we have also one thing, that is what does this maxilla articulates with. So let's study the articulations of the maxilla. Here you can appreciate that superiorly it articulates with the 3 bone, that is the nasal bone, the frontal bone, the lacrimal bone. So superiorly it articulates with the 3 bone, the nasal bone, the frontal bone and the lacrimal bone. Medially it articulates with the 5 bones, that is the ethmoidal bone, the inferior nasal concha, the vomer bone, the palatine bone, it also attaches with the opposite maxilla. So there are 5 bone medially, and laterally there are only 1 bone, that is the zygomatic bone. So this ends our articulation. Finally, we move on to the last part of today's lecture, that is the ossification of the maxilla. You must know that maxilla ossifies from the membranous. So it is membranous ossification from the 3 centers. You need to understand it has 3 centers of ossification. The maxillary proper, first center is called the maxillary proper, and 2 centers also called as premaxilla. So there are 3 centers. You need not to know more about this ossification. So we have the age changes of the maxilla. At birth, the age changes from birth to the death. During the birth, the maxilla consists of a little more of the alveolar process, and 2 sockets reach the floor of the orbit. So also the maxillary sinus is mere a furrow, so there is very less maxillary sinus. In adult, the vertical diameter increases and it is greatest due to the development of the alveolar process and increase in the size of the sinus. So gradually the alveolar process increases and the maxillary sinus also increases. But with the age, that is, it gets revert back. So it gets reverts back to the infantile condition. That is, the height is reduced as a result of absorption of the palatine process. So clearly we read the total maxilla. You can appreciate the bone also, that we have already discussed that the maxilla contains a body and the 4 processes. The four processes like the zygomatic process, frontal process, alveolar process and the palatine process. We also discussed the articulation of maxilla and the age changes of maxilla. So this concludes the maxilla. If you like this video, then please share this video with your friend and share knowledge. Keep supporting. Thank you.